Hello, BookTube. I recently saw a video on Kristen's channel, Enter the Book, that I very much liked. Of course, I love her channel. I'll leave a link to it down below. It was her talking about Nonfiction November, a massive BookTube event that's coming our way for November, where you are encouraged to read some nonfiction if you read none, to read more if you read some, put on by Olive at a Book Olive. I'll leave a link to Olive's announcement video for the 2022 version of Nonfiction November down below. And I'll leave a link to the Enter the Book video as well, which is her top nonfiction. She did a video about her top nonfiction. And I watched it, absolutely loved it. I took notes on it. It was eerie, some of the ways that we agreed and disagreed in the course of the video. Of course, that's why I love it when people make top lists or things like that. For instance, she made a recommendation of a book that I want to strongly, strongly second, and that is Tom Jordan's biography of Steve Prefontaine, the runner. It's just called P-R-E, and it's fantastic. Whether you're interested in running or not, it's absolutely fantastic. So it's just called Pre by Tom Jordan. If you're interested in the subject and have somehow missed it, oh my, you're missing a treat. And I also wanted to second a sentiment that was in her video, the weirdest thing in the world. Her top pick for her top nonfiction was the Bible. And I was bridling about that at first, of course, because although the lessons that she draws from the Bible are wonderful, in all, not just in this video, but in every video, that those lessons are wonderful. But the passage that she quotes is the first line in the book of Genesis. And it is most certainly fiction, not nonfiction. The world was not created by magic. But what she then said after that, what she said about that number one pick, had me just nodding completely. Which she said that no book has formed her more than this one. And I can't help but agree that I could say the exact same thing. So I'm not going to put the Bible on a list for me for nonfiction. There's precious little nonfiction in it, but I wholeheartedly second that sentiment as well. That was a neat launching off point. And then when I was finished watching her video, I thought, well, the only thing that's missing here is naked aggression. Surely this needs to be weaponized into a tag. And so that's what I want to make it. The My Top Nonfiction Tag. Explicitly so that we can give each other a whole bunch of enthusiastic recommendations for Nonfiction November. We're right on the doorstep of Nonfiction November. It couldn't be more perfectly timed. And I want to stipulate here that top nonfiction, in Kristen's video, she makes a point of saying that as she was thinking about her entries, she realized that these were, in fact, her absolute favorites of nonfiction, and even ranked. I want to stipulate that you don't need to do that. I myself, I'm not sure that my listings would be the same from year to year, and I'm not sure that yours would be either. And that raises the anxiety level of worrying that you're leaving something out. So I want the My Top Nonfiction tag to be 10 pieces of nonfiction that you absolutely love. No reason to rank them. And therefore no reason to play gotcha with people saying, hey, but I thought you liked, or hey, but why didn't you mention that sort of thing. Just mention 10 really good, basically nonfiction recommendations for other people coming up for Nonfiction November. And I picked 10. I've got 10 analog books here. That's kind of rare. I don't have anything on the tablet to show you. And for some of them, I would like to read you portions of them. That happens on Enter the Books video. She reads you some portions of some things. I want to read you some. I won't read you from everything. But I want to read you from some things just to give you a sense of what they are, a sense of why I like them. The first one I will not read from. It is not necessarily this book. The first choice on my list is really an author. It is Cyril Connolly, the book critic, Cyril Connolly, who did a lot of other kinds of writing. He did travel writing and impressions of his day, sociological writing and whatnot. But his book reviews make him a prince in my profession. He is utterly wonderful when he writes a really good book review, meaning not necessarily a review of a good book, but a review where he is feeling his oats, where he's feeling in fine form, and also where his editor allows him to write what he wants, which is an element that a lot of people leave out. They neglect to remember it when they're assessing a critic's body of work. Is that there are plenty of times in plenty of circumstances, even when you're a big poobah like Cyril Connolly or even Gore Vidal, where an editor will tamp down what you've done. They might be worried about a civil action or a thrown punch at a party or something or other. And a lot of times, especially if you're not a poobah, if you're just a working reviewer, it's go along with that or have the piece pulled. So this is the selected essays of Cyril Connolly, really The Abandoned Playground, or really there are a whole bunch of collections that he has done. The Evening Colonnade will give you a huge selection of his work. There isn't a Cyril Connolly volume that I know of that does exactly what I want, sort of like the Annotated Essays of Virginia Woolf, where you get everything in chronological order with helpful footnotes to tell you what the book is, what the circumstances were to the extent that we know them. As far as I know, there is no volume like that for all of the book reviews and book essays of Cyril Connolly, but he had to be on the list. I go back to him over and over again. Now, where am I going to put these things? All right, this next one is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. Big honking thing, probably the whole of your Nonfiction November if you decide to devote it to this. But it's terrific. It is burned in passion. It glows with the author's hatred of the Nazis. A first-hand thing, a personal thing, because he was there as the boots were marching. It's not a historical subject for him entirely, although this is a massively impressive work of history. This is not a memoir. And I have heard plenty of people estimating various works of World War II history, or really any other history, say, well, isn't it outdated? And I never know what to say to that. I really don't. Of course, there have been document archives that opened in between when Shirer was writing this book and now. Does that mean this is outdated? No. I don't say that it does. I think that too often we too casually use the word outdated when it comes to history in a way that we would never say with most great fiction. And the reason is the same, and it's damning, which is that when we think of history, we don't think of artistry, and we should. This is a beautifully written book, passionately written, grippingly written book. So even though there have been many, many later histories of the rise and fall of the Third Reich, I'm still going to recommend this one. It's a large undertaking for your Nonfiction November, but it's fantastic. This next one is even longer. It's probably 3 times as long as The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, but only if you read it in its unabridged form, and that would be crazy to do. This is The Diary of Samuel Pepys. He was a Restoration political official and public figure to a small extent, and he kept a diary that is weird. It is weird. It was a bit of an intellectual fad in certain circles to keep a diary in his time, but not like this. Later on in his life, he kept a second diary that is very much along the lines of what we would expect, something that you would expect anyone to be able to read. Pepys wrote this thing as though he didn't even know that he was writing it, much less that he was writing it and it might be discovered by a nosy parlor maid. It's unbelievably frank about everyone all around him and also about himself, in ways that, as many people have commented over the centuries, or over the century since this thing really entered into popular reading, he includes a lot of details that would instantly have got him sacked from public life if anyone had read them. He includes them anyway, and he doesn't appear to think about it, and that lends an abridged version of his diary. The reason that I say abridged instead of the whole thing is because the whole thing, he wrote a lot that has no merit for reading now. He wrote a lot that does, but he wrote a lot that doesn't. There are plenty of entries that are simply an itinerary of where he went and what he spent on mutton. And there's no reason to include them in a volume. This is everybody's Peeps, but you also have the Penguin Classic shorter Peeps. There are plenty of abridgments, and they all do relatively the same kind of job, which is to go through and select the parts that still live and speak, that speak of the living man. So you don't want 10 entries where he's talking about, I really should fire Becky, my maid, because I really think she's a little lazy, over and over again, but just that line, nothing else. You really don't want endless details about him taking a boat to visit his patron. Instead, you want the living parts, the parts where he fights with his wife or makes up with his wife, sometimes in the same moment, or the Great Fire of London, or whatnot, things like that. So with when it comes to Peeps, for top nonfiction, I would say pick a really generous anthology. Don't go for, I think it's Modern Library has a shorter one, a very short volume of Peeps. That is an editor starting with The Great Fire of London and the Plague and working his way outward very slightly. You don't want that. You want somebody with a little bit broader vision of the appeal of this work. So a big selection would be good. The Penguin Classic shorter Peeps is great. That would be a perfect place to start. Don't mix it up with the earlier Penguin Classic selections for Peeps that is much, much shorter. Go for something that's at least 500 pages long. And it's delightful. I'm hedging my bets just a little. If I was willing to cavil a little about the Bible, then perhaps I should enter a little note of caution about Pepys' diaries as well. And there's a bit of fictionalizing going on in some places, but far less than you would expect, specifically because of that atmosphere of writing to himself, very literally. I know people who keep journals. I keep one myself. And the instinct to play to a gallery is almost irresistible. The idea that what you are writing will never be seen by anyone is almost impossible to adopt. I sometimes do myself, but only through long dint of practice. Most people that I know who keep journals expect them to be read. So they might tell me over wine and calzones at 1 in.the.morning that they viscerally hate person X, Y, or Z, but they won't say that in their journal, and Pepys does. So it's then we'll go from something very long to something very short. This is a book I've recommended on this channel many times. This is William Service's book Owl. A very thin thing about him taking in a little owl and learning about the creature, watching the personality of Owl, and seeing how Owl interrupts and warps the day-to-day life of the household. It's not in print anymore, I don't think, but it is absolutely, there we go. It's illustrated, at least this hardcover version is. It's absolutely wonderful. Just wonderful. It will put a smile on your face. Of course, as you can probably guess, I won't be spoiling anything here. When it comes to wild animal memoirs, most of them have a gut punch at the end. You just have to expect that. I have to expect that. There's no way to avoid it. That's not spoiling the book. The real question is, will that gut punch be done well? And it's done wonderfully here. So I can strongly recommend this if you can find a copy. Then this next one you won't have any trouble finding. Nor would you have any trouble finding it at any point in the last 2,000 years. This is the Histories of Herodotus. Now I have here the old Penguin Classic translated by Aubrey de Selincourt. And it is wonderful. Just wonderful. Full of stories. This is the story of the framing idea here is the Greeks versus the Persians. But that leads our author, who is an indefatigable researcher and also an indefatigable storyteller, into many, many a digression about the Persians. And all the stories about their royal people and the scandals and whatnot. It ends up being just a labyrinth of stories that are all so warmly and wonderfully told, dramatically told, as opposed to the large number of stories that you get, for instance, in Thucydides. These are dramatically told, almost like a page from Aeschylus, rather than from the annals, at the local nobleman's house. This, as a result, is infinitely rereadable. This Aubrey de Selincourt translation. Oh, well, this Penguin Classic says that his translation is revised by A.R. Byrne. And I don't remember, I have a much earlier version of this that is not revised in any way, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter that it's Aubrey de Selincourt. It's tough to blunt the pleasure of Herodotus. I've never met a translator that quite did it. So your aces, no matter what translation you pick. And even if I were to do a list of my 10 favorites, as opposed to just a top 10, he would definitely be on it. Then this next one is older. I don't know if it's still in print. It's Ted Sorensen's book on Kennedy, on President Kennedy. Ted Sorensen was with him almost all the time and had a particular insight into his personality. An insight that other members of the inner circle, of Kennedy's inner circle, often said that the insight would start with Sorensen and then move its way to its subject. That Kennedy would start to think differently or behave differently after long conversations with this particular aide. I'm not sure how much that is true. But this is, again, a perfect example, like the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. of a book that is, I think, denigrated unfairly by later people, by especially later Kennedy biographers who say, well, Theodore Sturgeon unabashedly admired this man and was also an employee of this man. So it doesn't matter how long the book is, doesn't matter how priceless the first-hand impressions are, it's still completely biased, and so it's worthless as biography. That, I think, is totally unfair. Although, he did admire his subject. I want to read you just a bit so that you can get a sense of that. This is a little segment there's a segment of a book called The Man in the White House, and there's a segment inside that segment called The Power of the Presidency. One of John Kennedy's most important contributions to the human spirit was his concept of the office of the presidency. His philosophy of government was keyed to power, but not as a matter of personal ambition, but of national obligation, the primacy of the White House within the executive branch and of the executive branch within the federal government, the leadership of the federal government within the United States and of the United States within the community of nations. And yet he almost never spoke of power. Power was not a goal he sought for its own sake. It was there in the White House to be used without any sense of guilt or greed as a means of getting things done. He felt neither uplifted nor weighed down by power. He enjoyed the presidency, thinking not of its power but of its opportunities, and he was sobered by the presidency, thinking not of its power but of its obligations. Notice the inveterate speechwriter cadences here. He was a strong president primarily because he was a strong person. Now, that kind of prose you're not going to get in a much later biography of Kennedy. You'll get it in a bunch of windy, stupid hagiographies, but it's something that's meant to be just a straightforward biography of Kennedy will not have any of that. It won't have any of that diction, first of all. It will be typically the denuded academic press of today, but it also won't have the fervor of belief. And I don't think that hampers this book at all. It's like Sorensen often said when he was writing this book and when he was talking about it in later years. It was impossible to produce that kind of saccharine crap when you had the strong feeling every time you put pen to paper that the boss was looking over your shoulder and he'd have been the first one to scoff at it. I go back to this a lot. I have a battered copy here. I go back to it a lot, so it's on my list. Then we'll go back to my own profession, the profession of book criticism, of occasional prose, in this case quite literally. This is a volume called Occasional Prose. This is by Mary McCarthy. This is a collection of pieces that she did for whatever paying venue would have her on politics. She loved to write about politics, on society, and also on literature. She was an avid reader and an insightful critic of reading. I want to read you from an essay of hers that I love. I went straight to it when I picked up this book. It's called On Rereading a Favorite Book. And it has a large section on Anna Karenina that I wanted to read you. For me, Anna Karenina is terribly true, almost truer than a novel ought to be. No illusions are permitted to survive in its rigorous climate. War and Peace is softer, more clement. Levin ends Anna with the admission of his own incorrigibility. He has not changed, he has always dreamed he would, and now he knows that he never will be different. Still, that is not quite the end. He tells himself at once that there is a difference, even though it is imperceptible, an inner difference that he owes to the rediscovery of the Christian truths he has known as a child. True, nothing outwardly will change, but he has lost the inner feeling of meaninglessness. Now every minute of his life has a, quote, positive meaning of goodness with which I have the power to invest it. These are the last words of the novel, and a kind of consolation. But since, precisely, by Tolstoyan standards the proof should be visible and palpable, there is no reason to believe that this too is not an illusion. Of a very common kind, created by need. Everyone needs the good, hankers for it, as Plato says, because the lack of it is in the self. This greatly craved goodness is meaning, which is absent from the world, outside the chain of cause and effect, and incommensurable with reason. You don't have to agree with her pronouncements on that or any other book, but oh my, is she fun to read on the page. Then we have another work of nonfiction. This is a big fat biography, just in case you're in the mood for that. I have, as was true with Kristen's video, some of your top nonfiction are going to be deeply personal choices. I mean, there's a reading in which they all will be, right? Because a book that you really loved is a deeply personal thing. But some of them go beyond that. Some of them, it's deeply personal in ways that don't have anything to do with the book. It's still they're completely bound up with the book. There's no way to extricate the two. And this is one of those. There are long stories that I could tell over wine and calzones here if you ever come over. But this is one of those books for me. This is Mary Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. There is our author. Once upon a time, books had the confidence, the good taste to do this. They showed you their author as opposed to filling the back with meaningless blurbs from book critics like me. This is a gigantic history, a biography of Mary Queen of Scots. Again, like with The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I don't think this has ever been meaningfully surpassed in terms of its research. Unlike World War II, the research with Mary Queen of Scots is largely static. We're not getting much in the way of new archives opening up. But also in terms of the stateliness and wonderfulness of its execution. This is not quippy, like Cyril Connolly or like Mary McCarthy. It's also not written in savage hatred, like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's far more stately than those. But that has a spell of its own. My, is this enjoyable to read. Now, I feel confident that I can recommend this thing in a video like this on its own merits, even separated from all of the personal stuff about when I first read this, when it first came out, and how much it meant to me, and the environment where I read it, and the people I knew when I was reading it, and the things that were happening in my life. That all of those things are bound up with this book in a way that they'll never be with any other biography of this figure. It's not like Mary Queen of Scots is especially fascinating to me. But the book itself has lots of merit. Again, I want to read you a bit. This is from Mary being laid away in her tomb. So the Queen of Scots found peace at last. There can be little doubt that Mary, who cared so much and so prolongedly for the English succession, would have been satisfied at the last with her burial place in Westminster Abbey, among the kings and queens of England. Her rights as a queen, to which she attached so much importance to the end, had thus been respected. Viewing that splendid edifice in marble, white in the darkness of the Henry VIII Chapel, the last of the royal monuments and the most imposing of them all, she would surely have felt that the cruelty of Elizabeth in denying her the French burial she craved had been atoned for in this unlooked-for and glorious manner. It's just lovely all throughout. Every aspect of Mary's life, and also by extension Elizabeth's rule, is beautifully written about in this book. Just beautifully written. Then when it comes to beautiful writing, we're getting towards the end. We've got 2 more to go. This is an absolute favorite of mine. One of you actually sent me a copy of this. This is Roger Lansing Green, Heroes of Greece and Troy, from eons ago. When did this come out? Do I even want to know when this first came out? 1958. And like Mary Queen of Scots, this has a entirely personal significance for me, apart from the wonderfulness of how it's done. This is a retelling of the myths of Greece and Troy, ending with a retelling of the Iliad and then the Odyssey. Very briefly, not a long book at all. And I love the sort of frosty pedagogical tone, that wonderful old-style pedagogical tone that teachers used to adopt to their students. I love the sense that I get in this book, and also in Edith Hamilton's mythology and Bullfinch's mythology, now that I think of it, mythology retellings just in general, the sense that the author knows so much more, that they are guiding you firmly but gently through a vast profusion of a subject matter. Some of you might have felt that same thing when Stephen Fry does this sort of thing. Maybe it brings that out in writers. But I want to read you something towards the end of the book, after Roger Lansing Green has finished up his account of Odysseus and the suitors, of Odysseus coming back home to Ithaca and slaying the men who would try to steal his kingdom. And that is where the old tales come to an end. For Odysseus was really the last of the heroes. There were no stories about Telemachus or his children. The old books say that he had a son called Perceptolus, but that is only because doubtless some Greek family claimed descent from him. In his lifetime, the great-grandsons of Heracles came back to Greece from exile in the north and conquered most of it, but that is where history begins and legend ends. For the heroic age ended when Odysseus died. Its brief golden gleam lasted only a little while, scarcely longer than the triple lifetime of Tiresias, and then the immortals ceased to mingle visibly with mankind, and neither Zeus nor any of them married mortals or had mortal children. Helen was the youngest child of Zeus. Lovely. Absolutely wonderful. I love this thing. I like so many other books on this list. I go back to it over and over again. And then we will finish up nonfiction top list with a book that I have praised on this channel many, many, many times. This is Francis Hackett's biography of Henry VIII, which is almost a century old. So once again, it evokes, when did this come out? Once again, it evokes 1929, almost a century old. This once again evokes the same caution that I've had with a couple of other books on this list, which is the worry for me of people saying that if this is 100 years old, it must be outdated. I've never quite understood that. I don't know why we treat history and biography that way. This is gorgeously written and incredibly insightful. And those things don't become outdated. So this is a soup to nuts life of Henry VIII. I often read from one particular passage in here, but I'm not going to do that this time because I've read that passage a few times on this channel. Instead, I'll read from another bit that reflects a phenomenon that often happens in biographies, and that is definitely true in this biography, if it wasn't true from the beginning. Often when you read a long biography, you get the sense that the biographer, as he goes on, comes to hate his subject. Whether that's from being trapped with the same person over and over again, or whether maybe the biography itself was born of hatred from the beginning. I don't know. I get the strong sense that it's true with Hackett. He is entirely in favor of the golden Prince Henry who comes to the throne, tall, athletic, handsome, open-minded. And he grows less and less enamored of that Henry as that Henry grows more older and tireder and more bloodthirsty. And he reflects on that. He reflects on the popular image in this passage. It is only bit by bit that a man like Henry comes into a situation really desperate. He's powerful to begin with, and active in assertion of his forces. His manner is so confident, his presence is so robust, his health so vigorous, that his fate seems anxious to live up to his jolly and rubicund reputation. In a word, where credit is half the battle, and where the appearance of prosperity is itself halfway toward the fact of prosperity, the national monarch who has the air of a magnificently successful innkeeper, a man who recommends his own good cheer by looking as if he always enjoyed it, cannot convince anyone that he is not the soul of good fellowship, with his heart at least as big as his stomach. Look at that plump, beaming face, and the merry jowls, and the twinkling eyes, and the glowing golden hair. Even if Henry shaved his poll after the recent executions and had his beard cut shovel-shape, it could not convince the world that he was anything but old King Cole, a bluff King Hal, the sort of man who eats a baron of beef and says, "Arise, sirloin." These are 1930s jokes, that remind me. The sort of man who cuts off his wife's head, ha-ha, out of a big, jovial, exuberant good humor. Off with her head, off with the next one's head. The more the merrier. You notice Charles Laughton here in this description, and it's being demolished. But this great bouncing King Hal, this prince of good fellows, who was to divert himself by doing to two wives what so many men have never been able to do even to one wife, this Boniface among the kings is one of the most vulgar and fatuous and horrible of illusions. This big-faced, little-eyed man, whom Holbein immortalized, is not a healthy soul, who went through wives as some men go through socks, with a kind of hilarious destructiveness. Henry did not lead a life like a barn dance, where one girl after another was slung into his embrace and slung out again. Rabelais might have invented this grand, ruddy, pot-walloping, trilling and trawling Falstaff of a Henry. Otherwise, he never existed. He is the myth of the eternal schoolboy who goes by the picture on the cover. That is just lovely. The whole book is full of that. Not a single character is spared. Henry least of all, but everybody gets their time on the dissecting table, whether they are praised or condemned. They still get their time in the spotlight. Oh, I can't resist. I have to read you the other passage. I just have to, because it's about Erasmus. It's about the Dutch humanist Erasmus, and I love this so much, and who knows how long it's been since I read it on this channel. Hackett gets to a point, the point in the story where Erasmus dies. This was the most famous person in the world, the most famous writer in the world. And he writes about it so wonderfully. I'll just read it, and then we'll finish up this video with that. Meanwhile, rational Europe, trying to keep inflammable passion and mad peasant blood within decent bounds, had lost its greatest spokesman in Erasmus. He died in April. The torch of good reason, for the moment, was dimmed. Two firebrands, still obscure, were planning the conquest of mankind for a Christ of their own making, each asking his followers to immolate their reason and to bind their will. In 1536, John Calvin published his Institutio. In the same year, a Spanish Basque, who was to be known as Ignatius Loyola, was finishing his studies at Paris that underlay the Society of Jesus. Henry's moderation on the terms of his own dominance would push half-evolved Europeans along the road of the modern state, while Calvin and Loyola, borrowing statecraft and rousing the lust of warfare with the breath of the eternal, would stir in religion precisely the same appetite for earthly dominance. Beside them, Erasmus might seem a feeble creature, sitting by his open fire with a glass of Burgundy in front of him, but Erasmus had made the New Testament his labor of love. He was not a hero, like Loyola or Calvin. He was not an emperor, as Henry now called himself. He was only a humanist. Besides him, the Jesuits, affirming liberty and vowing obedience, or the Calvinists, affirming predestination and applying the scourge, recalled very ancient priesthoods and glorious savage instincts that cry out from the caverns to be released, even if they must carry a Bible in their hand. Yet the Galilean Jew could not have despised the humanists. If he had rested by the fire with Erasmus, this book of the New Testament on his knees and a glass of Burgundy before him, perhaps he might have raised those sad eyes to see that truth and charity had lingered for an instant at Basel, finding an honest welcome there, and that the Word was still alive, that the arm of the law and the methods of torture, to which his own thin hands bore witness, were perhaps not the only ways to prize the divinity in man. As I've mentioned many times before on my channel, that as tributes go, you could look at a whole shelf of Erasmus biographies and not find anything better than that, and I believe every word of it is accurate. So that's the final book on our list here, is Francis Hackett's Henry VIII. Unfortunately, I'm realizing now, as I finish up this list, how many of these things are not in print, but that's my list. I want to hear yours. And I would appreciate it, since we're giving each other fervent recommendations for Nonfiction November, I'd appreciate it if you'd go into some depth. Don't just show me the book and then move on to the next one. Read a bit from it. Or tell me a little bit about it. What makes it so special? I would love to hear it. I go to BookTube a lot for book recommendations, so I'm hoping that the rest of you will consent to do your top nonfiction tag. I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.